We are finding is that because the features are different, obviously, from the older programs to CMS, there's a lot of data gaps that are in there, and that creates some issues when you're looking at trying to get the most out of your CMS product. A few years ago, or a number of years ago, FSI was standardized, tried to set up some standard and best practices for the facilities departments. Again, we're bringing them from paper. We wanted to show them some ways on how to set up their CMS to better suit them, and using that electronic version. And so we set up a lot of standards. They were categories, they were asset categories, they were statuses for work orders and statuses for assets and those type of things. We did not, however, have a lot of standards for the clinical engineering groups. And about 3 years ago, we started to develop some clinical standards, some best practices that if we did bring some groups in that did not have those really solid bases in their current programs, they could start to use some of those standards. Kevin came on board earlier this year, and he reviewed what we had put together. Many of you, if you have been involved with implementations with us, we have those standard sheets that we send out that say the standard configuration sheet. And there we ask a lot of questions about what you do in your department and how you set up your work orders and how you want to have your assets look and your locations and so forth. And so taking that into consideration, we started to develop both. We had the facility side, we started to develop that clinical standard sheet as well. And as I mentioned, when Kevin came on board, he looked at that, plus he added a lot of things to those standardizations and those best practices. And then he took a deep dive into the reports. And as we talked to you all over the years, reporting seems to be one of the areas that you really have some concerns about. You want to be able to get as much information out of the system as possible in order to relevant information in order to present to your leadership and to fully and completely manage your departments. So what we've got today is we're going to show you a little bit of those standards, that those recommendations that we're putting out there. Now, this is not the gospel. This is just going to be options for you to use. If you're going to be new to CMS, we can deploy these immediately. If you currently are a user of the program, we can certainly work with you to get these implemented as well. It's totally up to you on how you want to implement and how you want to look at these particular standards. So what I'm going to show you today is I'm just going to kind of give you a brief overview and of where we are. I wanted to start off by the dashboard. When you log into CMS, you obviously have your dashboard, and I'm sure everybody is aware. And first off, I'll come up here to our little menu. Here are the various modules that you have access to in this particular case. And when we get into our dashboard, you realize that you have options for tabs across the top that allows you to create these searches and these views for you as a user to get that information right at your fingertips. If you went into specifically a work order area or an asset area, you have the searching capabilities for sure, but you don't necessarily want to have to do that every time you're looking for information. So you do have the ability to create these dashboards, customize them for yourself or for your teams. And these are just some of the ones that we have here. In this case, Kelly Walters has got a My CMS page with certain panels on it. There's one with work orders that are assigned to Kelly. We have pending work orders that are currently in the system. There's also some high risk PM work orders that want to keep a track of that. And so we see those here down below. And then there's also a panel for some hazard and recall work orders. We'll also see across the top that we have some additional tabs active PMs, high risk PMs, upcoming warranties. I don't believe there's anything in there. We're staying on top of that. And but there are, look at that, unscheduled work orders. Here we are, or unassigned work orders, I'm sorry. So you can get a quick snapshot of activities that's going on in the department and managing. Here again as another snapshot of some recalls, some hazard and recalls. A different way of displaying it here on the tab as opposed to in a panel that we saw earlier. And then we also have a panel here for forecast reports, some of the reports, and Kevin will be going over some of those reports that have been updated with the clinical engineering group in mind. As you go into your work orders area, we want to talk a little bit about how you set up your work orders and some of the things that you do to better serve that work order in your facility. You do know that these are actually buttons. So in this case, we're looking at active PMs, but if you set this up, you can see that you can create multiple searches here as well. And these become different views that you might want to put on your screen. And so this is what we call save searches. That's one of the options that we have in CMS that allows you to create these save searches. You also have different views that you can create, and these are the save views. These are very important because as you create these save searches and save views, that's what you're going to be using to feed those panels that we saw on that dashboard. So you have everything's connected as far as getting that information. You still have the ability to come over here and to do a search for a particular work order. And then obviously you can come and add, do the add for the work order. And then we have the other functions as far as printing and then also uploading the work order into the system as well. If we come over here into a specific work order, and I'm going to find one, I have actually a work order that I wanted to show you some of the information on. So I'm just going to search this work order. Let's see here, and I'm going to go ahead and just do a search on this particular work order. It happens to be an annual PM. It is a physio unit, and it's a LifePak 20. So if we go into this work order, you're going to be able to see here all the detail that has been put out there. Now, there's not a requester's name or phone number, but this is a system generated particular service request. And we see here that the status is inactive. This is one of the things that we have some standards that we put out. And if you look at our statuses, it's going to show you, well, there's active, but if you look underneath that, there are several subcategories that you might want to consider for these work orders. And you have unable to locate, not assigned, and so on, awaiting parts. That's always a valuable one. And still active in the system, but we have to wait for parts, or we're waiting for a vendor to come in. The job type. Now, in this case, it's a preventive maintenance. But these are, again, some of the other changes and standards that we're putting out there. We're saying corrective maintenance, equipment evaluation, incident inspections. These are all things that the biomed clinical engineering groups are involved with. System modifications. So again, recalls, incoming inspections. How about an in-service that you have to perform? So this allows you to separate those job types. Everything's not going to be a corrective maintenance or a service request. It's going to fall into one of these other categories. It allows you to search and keep track of where you're spending your time. Under priority, very simple, high, medium, and low. There's not much left as far as priorities are concerned. Yes, you can get into the detail. You can put in all kinds of different things on if you want it to be a certain time frame or anything like that. But let's face it, high, medium, or low are going to be those categories. And so we put this out here as a best practice. The modality. Now, in some of you are involved with the facilities department, that's often called the trade. And so you have plumbers and carpenters, but in biomed, you don't have that. But you do have the departments are separated typically on the type of equipment that they might be responsible for. And in this case, you've got biomedical equipment, general biomed equipment. You also have imaging equipment. How about laboratory? Isn't that typically something a little bit more specialized? Not all of it, but some of it. You've got test equipment. Another one you might want to throw in there, anesthesia, respiratory therapy. Some of these areas are really different, different training involved, and these are different modalities that you might want to be involved with. So again, allows you to do some reporting, allows you to set these work orders up and do some tracing on them. Locations. Now, when I set up a department in implementation, I preach that locations are paramount to setting up your department or setting up your program. And they're extremely important. You want to make sure that you have your buildings, your campuses, your buildings, your floors, even your departments. In some cases, you can go a little bit deeper and you can say not only in the department, but you could also say, oh, I've got exam rooms, and you could put those in there. You can go down to the various levels. But also in clinical engineering, the cost center is also very important. Not so much in the facilities department, but definitely in the clinical engineering. You have your cost centers, and so you want to make sure that your cost centers are put in there as well. So you're going to have your department, your locations, but your cost centers are really something that you need to put in there. And excuse me. And typically, this is because ownership of your equipment is owned by that particular department. Oftentimes, the budgets for servicing come out of that department, and you've got to bill back and you've got to charge those departments. And so the cost centers become, for your finance group, the cost centers become very important when it comes to the clinical equipment. As you're looking further on the record, you see you have assignments on this particular work order. You'll also notice down below here, we've got a couple of other little what we call UDFs. And in this case, there's one that says results action taken. Okay, and these are some other standards that we're putting out there. Now, many of you know that there's a big push right now to standardize across the industry these action items, these error codes, and so forth. And here's an opportunity where you can put those into the system and use those standard ones that they put out there on your work orders. So that way, again, you'll be able to utilize those, track those, report on those as necessary. And you can see some of the codes that we have in here, again, as our best practices and as the standardizations are. You also have same in all places. You have your complete information over here. Here's another location you can put those codes. Some folks put them up here in the completion comments. Some actually put the code information, the actual number there as well, but you could put those in this area here as well. And then it'll come out as a comment when you complete this particular work order. You do have your procedures in here, and in this particular case, we have a couple of procedures associated with this work order. And if we open this up, you're going to see in here is an example of how you can utilize your readings and set those up. And I know that our support team, about a month ago, they had a couple of different programs. They have monthly programs for training. They had a couple of programs on how to set up procedures, how to set up your readings and your schedules. And here you can see we're asking for output test. Excuse me again. And your output test, you can see what your last result was. So when you put in your new result, you can do a comparison immediately from when your last result was. And then we have a second one down below is just a pass fail on your leakage and making sure that you have that information. So this is how you can set up your procedures on your work orders itself. You've got your asset record here. And we're going to go in there in just a moment. You've got a location for your labor. Pretty much all of this is the same. Also notice down here under your attachment, you have the ability to add an attachment to your work order. In this case, we have an operations manual. So we want to get information about this unit. Our technicians have the ability to open up that operating manual and get any information about. I've also seen a lot of people will add pictures to this as well. And then that way they allows them to make sure they're looking at the right equipment and taking and they can add that to their attachments. And lastly, down below, notice there's one that says test equipment. And if you select this, what are you going to use to test this unit? Well, it's going to be a defibrillator pacer analyzer. And so you have that test equipment is right there. And it shows that surveyor when they come in, okay, you've tested this unit, you've closed out your work order. What was the equipment that you used? And this way you have the ability to have that information right in front of them. Okay. So this is just some of the ways that some of the information that you can put onto a work order. You obviously, there's some other things that you can add. Again, we have user defined fields, and by using those, you'll be able to add other fields that you might feel necessary to your particular work order for your technicians to take care of. I'm going to go ahead and jump from here right into the asset itself, and we're going to look at that asset record. So I'm just going to click here, and it's going to take me to our asset record. And we're going to get into how to set up an asset record here and some of the changes and standards that we've put out here. But notice all the information that we have set up here. And you've got your manufacturer. And when it comes to assets, we feel that in order to have a good, strong base, a standardized system, you need to have everything has to be consistent throughout the program. Your manufacturers have to be consistent. Your asset descriptions need to be consistent. Your categories really need to be consistent across all of your equipment. It's just easier to find and easier to report on things. Notice how the manufacturers are set up here. Physio Control, Medtronic, Stryker. For those who have been in the field a long time, you know it's always coming up that another company buys out somebody else. And you've got equipment out in the field that's got an old faceplate on it of information, but it's been bought and sold a couple, 2 or 3 times down the road. So how do you keep track of that? How do you know who are you going to deal with? What vendor are you dealing with today on a piece of equipment that you know is 15 years old, 10 years old, and it has a different faceplate on it. So here's one of the things that have been done, and we've added this manufacturers. We've got all of these listings in here that give you an ability to drop through here and look at. You've got Bear Hugger, right? You've got ATL Phillips on the ultrasound units. And as you go through this listing, you're going to see that you're ended up having multiple vendors and kind of give you a history of what that vendor is. Once that vendor is selected, and we're going to show you this in a moment when we go to set up an asset, but we have our model numbers. Because we have this vendor selected, you can have the system create in such a way or set up in such a way that when you select the model, only the models that are associated with that particular vendor are going to be displayed. So now you don't have to go searching for all kinds of different numbers. You don't have to put in and type in a lot of information and free text it. Kevin's going to talk about the setup of the free text and how we're kind of discouraging that on the clinical side especially. But you're going to, you have this options that can set up your systems and your segments to make sure that doesn't take place. Obviously, your serial number is going to change. Your cost center, that's going to be here. In this case, we have it in the imaging department. We're using our status of active, high. Our category, again, one of those items that we want to standardize. And we want to make sure that that category is the same across all defibrillators or across all equipment, that the appropriate category, so we can do some searching and tracing and tracking on that. Our risk classifications are set up. Notice the standards and changes here. We have two. There's a high risk and a non-high risk, but you have is it an alternative equipment management program, or is it going by the OEM? So you got the AEM and the OEM, the vendor, on all the way down. So these are so again, best practices that we're deploying. And our modality in this case, also notice that you have your risk factor in here. We do have multiple risk manager layouts that you can use if you so choose to use these. And this is just one of them that you can see here is deployed, but allows you to set those risk manager up if you want to do so in the program. Again, another option that you would have available to you. And then there's other information down here as well. You've got your warranty, you've got your life expectancy if you wanted to run that. In this case, it's 7 years. It was started in 2015. So we have about a year and a half left life expectancy, but it's still in good condition. We have some other fields that we filled out, including if you wanted to put a MAC address or an IP address, or does it have PHI? You want to put that in there as well. Those are fields that you can add to the equipment record. Again, another attachment over here, the operating manual that we had, and work order history is there as well, and our procedures. So that's the way, this is the asset record. Now I did want to jump over real quick, and let's take a look at the setup of that asset record. And so we're going to jump into the asset module, and we're going to do our plus sign in order to add that new asset. Obviously, we're going to start off with a asset number, a unique ID number, unique for your system. We don't want any duplicates out there. Now notice the asset description is not a required field, but obviously we're going to want to put something in there. But watch something that happens when we set up our asset. We talked about that manufacturer. So let's come in here and say, you know what? We want to set up another physio unit. And so we're going to select physio. When we do that, now only the models that are available for physio are going to be selected, and we're going to do a 20 again. Now we know that our serial number is different. We know our cost center is going to be different. We did set up some defaults, which you can do. We have it set up for status under warranty, high priority. You can make any changes that you want, but these are just the defaults. But also notice when these were selected, that asset category that we feel is so important to make sure you have consistent automatically is selected, as well as the asset description is set up to automatically display. So imagine having all of these things set up in your system. So when you go to make an input, you don't have to, regardless who the individual is, putting that information in. Once you go and you set this up, it's going to be very consistent across the board. For those of you who have been using CMS for a while, you do know that you have the ability to set up classification based on the category of the equipment. And so this could also be used and also be filled out as well, right? And so we could put that in there. So you can see how easily by setting it up properly at the very beginning during that implementation phase, you can see how it makes life easier. And then in the long run, you'll be able to, it's going to help you in getting your reporting done and so forth. We also have some other things down here, device ownership, status of the support status, and so forth. But these are just a few of the things that we've been doing in order to kind of standardize what we have out there. But that big area that you guys have been talking about are the reports. And so I want to turn it over to Kevin now, let him go over some of those reports that have been modified to fit the clinical engineering need. So Kevin?
Okay, thank you so much, Charles. Really appreciate it. That was a great overview. Let me go ahead and share my screen again. Before I actually begin reports, what I wanted to start with is take off a little bit of what you reviewed. I mean, you really reviewed some great stuff that this software application can do for you. First off, I want to talk about Charles was talking about the manufacturer models. Everything when it comes to standardization is all based on that. And what we're looking to do is get you away from list or free text and get you into list items only, because that's what's going to make your life a whole lot easier, okay, when it comes to really standardizing your information. So when we do that, I'm now going to go, I'm actually in the version 3 here because I can get a little more in-depth into the configuration. I'm going to go into companies, and let me just go into the search, okay? And first I'll just go ahead and search and just show you some of what Charles already talked about, dealing with different things with, okay, here's Polaris, CareFusion, they're now part of BD, Air Shields, Draeger, with that. So that's something that can happen a lot within the system. Now, other things we can do with here as well, as you can see, we've got the company type there, manufacturer, vendor, or just a vendor. I've also set up categories in here. Are they a division of a company, or are they the parent? In this case, they're related to biomed and imaging, lab, or do they deal with test equipment, things like that. Now let's go back to my criteria. One of the things I wanted to show you that I noticed when I looked through data here is I look at Welsh Allen. Well, Welsh Allen's one of those companies that was starting to buy up a lot of other companies. Obviously, they've got Quinton, Diatech, Bebron, some of those, Scaletronics, but they since have been bought by Hill-Rom, okay? Now, I've got a little spreadsheet showing you a little bit of what I'm talking about here. Here is just a list of some of the different ways that some of our users who aren't using active standardization have Welsh Allen in multiple different ways. Could be spelled W-E-L-C-J-H or W-L-S-C-H, different ways of spelling it. We can see some of you have also started to look at this. They're starting to do what we're kind of doing. Scaletronics, Welsh Allen, that's great. I love to see that. The protocol. But now we can now be able to standardize those assets so that everything from here down is all Welsh Allen / Hill-Rom. Okay, so once we get the manufacturers standardized in here, we can now start looking at our models. So if I go to, and I'm looking at just these 690s, there's so many different ways of identifying the 690s and the 692s. Well, now we have a standardized manufacturer, and now we have a standardized model on here as well, either the 690 or the 692. And then what we can then do is the next step of that is standardizing our different asset category based on all the other different categories and descriptions we may have. We now have a singular manufacturer, model, and asset category that we can now have across our entire system. So if I go back in here, and let's look at just Welsh Allen here, I'm going to click on our universal edit button, which is our pencil. Click on that. Okay. And then I can, down here, I'll scroll down a little bit so you can see this. Down here, I now can be able to go in and see, okay, I've got the SureTemp plus 690s and the 692s. Let me just click on one of these, I'll open it up a little bit. And now I can show that, okay, I've got that manufacturer model on here, or I mean the model name and number, just a general asset description, but all the defaults that Charles was going through earlier, this is where you can set those up so they automatically apply. Whenever I add a new SureTemp 692, it's automatically going to fill in the rest of this information. And that's what's really going to help you in really standardizing your data in the long run. Okay. Also with this, let me get out of here real quick. In dealing with standardization, also when we get into looking at, I just want to show you real quick about when we get into contracts as well. If you haven't used contracts a lot, there is a lot of features available within the contracts that you can be able to utilize also. Let's look at this whole logic contract, for example. I've set this contract up. We've used the categories, again, using at different levels. It's a full service contract, but it does not include glassware. So we can identify those types of things within our contract. General information, what assets are related to that contract, etc. This is important because I'm going to get into showing you a little bit about things that we can do once we get this data into our system. And so let's start looking at the reports within here. So let's take a quick review. Now, I went through, and being the new guy, I kind of had a little bit more leeway, and I went through all the reports in the system. Some of them didn't work. Some of them just didn't provide the information that I thought would be really good for clinical engineering. So what we've done is I set up some, went through and identified, I think there's about 11, 13, something like this, a few reports on here, I think 11 reports on here regarding things that we've done updates for ads. My goals were to ensure regulatory compliance. That's the most important thing. Confirm our PM procedures and schedules are correct. Work order labors and materials. Any work order issues, and of course also looking at our labor as well and how we have different labor types that we can utilize. So when we first start here, again, I go back to setting this up as a list item only, because once we get that set up and we get things standardized in our system, we can now be able to look at the very first report we modified. Here is a list of all your manufacturers and their associated models. Now, what we did with this report also is we added the asset category to that as well. Okay. And then it gives us, the bottom med here is our segment name, and so we can have multiple segments on here, and then gives us the total count of each of those manufacturers and how many of those models we have in the system. But again, this needs to be set up in your manufacturer model database. Next, one of the things that Charles was also talking about was our risk classifications. Again, dealing with high risk, non-high risk, AEM, OEM, and then also what the vendor is using as well. So this allows us to be able to provide this type of report to show exactly how our risk classifications are assigned to all our assets. Now, in this particular report, we made some updates to better support clinical engineering by adding in our manufacturer, our model, and as Charles was talking about, the importance of our cost centers in there as well. So now this is a pretty good report showing us exactly, here's those two dexes we saw in the contract. We can be able to see those items and that they are set up for high-risk vendor OEM. Okay. Next report we had on here that we modified was our PM forecast year and month. Again, we added some things on here, adding our asset categories in, so we have a standardized way of identifying our assets. Also adding in our asset status, because okay, I've got active assets in here, But I've also got these items here that are under contract. Well, I may need to contact the vendor, and if I do this forecast for the next month, I realize, okay, I've got these assets under contract. I better call my vendor and get that scheduled for them to come in to do the PMs. Now, also what we did on here is we put in the number of PMs that are in this particular risk group, or in this particular, in this particular forecast, and the total number of hours. Now, this is a kind of a good general overview, but then we wanted to get a little more specific. And what we did is this one here, the PM forecast details by assignment and date range. Didn't do anything with the top section here at all as far as what we have here with estimated hours and work order count. But what we had down here below was just the hours that were on here. It didn't actually have the count. With this information, as a manager, I now have a good way to be able to verify my PM loading, not only for the number of hours I'm using, but also the actual number of assets that need to be scheduled. So now I can use that to help balance my system and make sure that in October I don't have a ton of work orders, and then in November I only got a few work orders. I want to make it easier so that I'm getting my PM completions at 100%, but I have to do that by making sure I have all my things spread out properly across the calendar year or whatever particular date range I've set up. Next report, asset detail with labor and material cost. Now, one of the things that Charles touched on as well is dealing with cost. Cost, true, but also think of cost and think of charges as allocations. You may not charge anyone, but at the same time, you need to justify your existence and showing, okay, the hours you spent, the labor associated with those hours, and material costs to show how much more efficient you are in how you manage the service of your assets. Now, this report is kind of totally redesigned in that it gives us a complete overview of our asset at the top. You see here we put in the asset number up here, the procedures that are assigned to this particular asset, and then also a summary of the different job sites that have been performed, and then an individual listing of all the work orders in your history for that particular asset. So this can be a really nice report if you have a surveyor and he pops out a asset number and says, show me the information on this particular asset. Well, you can show it to him online, but you can also run a report and be able to pull that up right in front of him and be able to show him how well you have everything all set up and how well everything is working within your PM system and service. Again, asset charges. Again, these can be allocations. In this particular report, what we did is we added the labor hours to it and we added the total cost. So that now, based on the particular asset category, we can now be able to see what's using up a lot of our time. I mean, we can see that syringe pumps, infusion pumps, gee, big surprise, they eat up a lot of our time. But some of these items up here, gas machines and some of these other analyzers, they eat up a lot of material costs as well. So again, allows you to be able to truly understand where you're allocating all your resources to as far as equipment, etc. This next one, I really didn't do any type of changes with the report itself, but what we did is, this is an aging report, and what we did is we put a summary at the top. So we can see all the aging of all our work order location and categories, preventive maintenance. And we see we've got 33 that are current this month, we got 17 from the previous month, and then a couple months old, there's still a couple that are still out there that have not been completed. But it gives you that nice summary of all these work orders that are out there to know how you're doing as far as aging goes with those work orders. So of course, trying to keep these zeros down here as much as possible. Now this report we modified a little bit. It says assets with more than three unscheduled work. It's really now 3 or more unscheduled. Again, this is a great report for repeat repairs. Am I having an issue with this particular asset? And here shows us our asset. It's a syringe pump. And we can see that we have had some different repairs going on, some different LEDs, LCD, the clutches are going, different things that were happening. So this one is giving us a little bit of problems, this particular asset. That allows us to see that if we're having repeats or if it's different types of repairs. So here we can see we got clutch. So we can know we've got maybe some clutch problems there with this particular syringe pump. Again, very similarly as well is if we want to look at assets that have more than a particular number, in this case more than 3 work orders during a particular period. This gives us all jobs, so we can see we've got PM here, but we've also got some CMs with this particular asset as well. So it allows us to be able to get that more information. Again, with this report, we add the work order category so that we can see the actual job types that are actually being performed versus just a description. Now, within the system, and not everyone is maybe aware of this, but we need to be able to add is you can have different labor hour types. You can have regular time, overtime, double time, travel time, all these different things that you can document on a particular work order. Now, this particular report here will allow you to be able to see, okay, here's all the different work orders we had and the different labor. But then at the very bottom of it, it'll give us a summary for Kelly here that he had 17 CMs, 3 incomings, 42 PMs, and he worked on 9 hazard recalls and the associated hours that went with those. So it gives you a little bit of a breakdown, not just of what he's been doing, but a summary as well with all the different regular hours, overtime hours, and total hours. So this can be a really good way to be able to track and make sure you've got some people who aren't doing too much of one and not enough of another job type. We talked about contracts earlier, and the reason I did is we had a current customer who was using contracts, and they were trying to get a particular information out, and we realized we didn't have that report. So right now, our development team is working on a new report, and this is basically how it's going to look. You'll be able to set the status, the category of your assets you're dealing with, the start and the end time date for those contracts. And then it's going to give you here, the blue here is the contract information. So we can see, okay, we got a STERIS contract, it's full service, it's active, the cost center. And we can see that this ends at the end of February next year. But then with that, we can also see that we have our different assets here as well, along with their statuses. So in this particular case also, we have one, this endoscope washer, that's no longer active. Well, when it comes to renew, we're going to want to make sure that we update that service agreement so it doesn't include this asset. And again, it's going to include all our contracts. I've just put some examples here, and then all the assets that are assigned to those contracts. So that should be out here in not too distant future, and we'll have this report available for you as well. Now, there were quite a few reports also that were really good just the way they were. And I wanted to identify some of those as well. For example, now this is a combination of 2 reports. You've got your PM completion percentages based on per technician, but then we also looked at it by your resource category and status. The reason is, if I look at David and Dan here, they didn't do 100% of their PM completion this month. Okay, they were slacking, or were they? We look down here at this report here, because of the statuses on the work orders, we can see that one of them was just not available for him to do the PM, and two of them they can't find. Well, if you remember, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services allows you to not have this count against you in your PM completion percentages. So now you have the documentation to show I was 100% compliant this month, in this case July. So because I now have the documentation for that. A second way of looking at it, as Charles was talking about, was by modality. Again, here, I got biomed and labor, weren't 100% complete. But again, because of that, we can now show we truly were 100% complete with our PM completion percentages for the month. PMs last month and PMs this month as far as showing you the statuses of where they're at. Now, I actually took this from a customer, so it's got quite a few statuses on there, which can be really nice, but it does give you a general overview about all of where your things are, where your PMs are at. So we can see here the orange is complete, it's 67%, and if we look at the green here, I think that is active. So we still got some active and then a few other little things in there. So we can see that we've done a good 2/3 of our PM so far this month. This gives you that quickie overview of where you're at. Now also your PM completion, or I should say work order completion by resource, this not only gives each of your workers, but it also shows scheduled and unscheduled for those numbers assigned and those complete. Now it has a canceled in here as well, but then gives you the percentages associated with that. So it can give you an idea how many you have that were assigned and completed during that time frame. Productivity. Everyone's looking to be productive these days. So where are we at? Here's all our technicians. Here's all our productivity. We can be able to see that productivity here, the number of hours that overall were worked, year-to-date hours and the total hours, but also the available hours as well. And then looking at each month. Now remember with this available hours, we have an interface with Kronos. And Kronos will allow you to be able to automatically put in those available hours so that you don't have to worry about that because it's all going to be based on your punches. Your technician punches in at, say, 7 in the morning and punches out at 3:30, you now have your available hours, okay? So things like that. So this Kronos interface, if you use Kronos, can be very handy for you. We're always adding new assets to our database. Okay, that's a given. But are we remembering to schedule them for PM? So this is assets without work order scheduled, or in this case, PM work order scheduled within a date range. So I've got my date range here, and I can see that for this year, upcoming year, I've got some assets that have not been scheduled for PM yet. So I need to, this will get me now, I've got the asset numbers I can go in and ensure that I get these assets scheduled for preventive maintenance. And then last one that I thought was kind of good too is that, we've got work requests as well. What departments are you getting most of your requests from? I mean, obviously, probably you're going to get a lot from ED, most likely. You're getting a bunch of respiratory and CS as well. So it kind of gives you that idea where you're at with your counts. So that's kind of an overview of the work orders. Heidi, do we have any questions that some people have raised that we want to try and get some answers for them?
Kevin, yes, we did. Thank you very much. First question is, please confirm that attachments can be URLs.
Yes, attachment can be URLs. I'm going to go back into here and just show you a work order real quick, just pull up some work orders. real quick here. Hopefully it'll be real quick. This is active PM. Let me just pull this up here. I'm just going to edit a work order. If you go down to attachments and you click on add attachments, it's going to have a button here. I can either be a file or it can be a link. So this is where you will put your URL here, and you can put a little description. So this can be the same on work orders, and there's also a place for a link on your assets as well. I hope that answers the question.
Okay.
Anything else?
Another question we have is, do I have to use the CMS Risk Manager?
No, you don't have to. You do not have to use the risk manager. It's there if you want to. As long as you can show your risk assessment strategy to a surveyor, that's what's truly important.
Okay, and we have another question. I am not using the classifications and want to. How can I implement them without editing each record?
Oh, that's a good question. If we look in here and we go to our assets, remember within CMS, we have a mass edit feature. And within this, we can be able to go through, and let's just load here. Let me actually pick defibrillators, for example. I can pick defibrillators, so I'm picking a particular group here again by asset category. And here's showing me my risk classification on here, okay? Now, if I click up in the upper left here, you're gonna see a little checkbox. I can check all of these. Now, if I go to my upper right, you'll see the little blue pencil. Remember, our pencil is our edit. This is going to allow us to mass edit these. Now, in this case, I've got 30 out of 30, but I'll just click it. I have two options here. So risk classifications, I could go ahead and null them out and say, okay, I don't want I want to clean out all the classifications if I had some in there. I could then save that, or in this particular case, let me just undo that, and I can then be able to select a particular classification. Click Save, it'll show that here. It'll click Save, and then it'll go through and apply those. So this is how you would, if you don't have any risk classifications, this is how you would do that. Now, one thing is with risk classifications, you can have multiples. So if you also want to put in here life support, life safety, critical, things like that, you can have multiple items in here as well. You can have multiple classifications assigned to an asset. So that can be very, very helpful for you in your system. And again, you can always clean that out. But then when you come back, boom, all your assets will now show the risk classification assigned to them. If you have questions on that, please don't hesitate to contact Charles or myself or our technical support team. Any one of us can help you with that.
And Kevin, that's all I have for today.
Oh, great. Well, hopefully Charles and I were very descriptive. I'm hoping that maybe if people would like, what we can do is we can, if they would like to have this review of the reports, maybe to help them with that, be glad to send that out to them. Anything that we can do to be of support to you, because we really want to help. Oops, I kind of went a little too far here. We really want to help all of our customers better utilize CMS and make your life easier, to be quite honest.